So let's start by thinking about how we can measure whether someone is a pro-social person or a moral person. And of course, one of the easiest ways to do that is to just ask them about themselves, right? So we could use self-reports for asking people about their pro-social behaviors and their moral behaviors. And I'm just going to show you some examples here. Of course, for the people who take this class for Tilburg University, you don't have to memorize these things for the exam. I'm not going to ask you to name 2 questionnaires. That's not going to happen. But I want you to be able to critically discuss with me in your exam what you think is the best way to measure pro-social and moral behavior. That's the end goal. But I'm going to give you some details so we can have some meat to actually start our discussion on. Okay, so for an example for self-reports, we could take a look at the pro-social personality battery. Here we have almost 60 questions that are asked to the participants that we want to know the prosociality of. And it has a couple of subscales. These subscales address specifically facets of prosociality, such as who's responsible for their behavior, how empathic is the person, how do they reason morally, and how helpful are they. And here's an example item. So participants in our research might be asked, if a good friend of mine wanted to injure an enemy of theirs, it would be my duty to try to stop them. And then they're supposed to give some kind of a response on a rating scale. Is this my duty? Mostly yes, or rather no. Okay. And for more examples, we can also consider the self-report altruism scale that has 20 items. And an example would be, I have offered my seat on a bus or train to a stranger who was standing. It's a pretty straightforward behavior. We also have the honesty-humility subscale of the hexaco model. And here we have 16 self-report items, and there's one, so out of the honesty-humility subscale, there's again a subscale for sincerity, fairness, avoiding greed, and being modest. And one of the example items for being an honest person is to say, I would never accept a bribe, even if it was very large. If we are moving now clearly rather towards the idea of moral or ethical behavior, we could consult the ethics position questionnaire that has 2 subscales. One of them deals with idealism or pragmatism. And here an example would be, what is ethical varies from one situation in society to another. Or the relativism scale, which asks questions like, should people make certain that their actions never intentionally harm another, even to a small degree? And one of the classics of talking about moral types, moral personality, is the Moral Foundations questionnaire, which considers 5 facets: harm versus care, fairness and reciprocity, in-group loyalty, authority and respect, and purity, sanctity. And we'll get back to this one in more detail in the next session. But let me just give you an example item here. An example would be, when you decide whether something is right or wrong, to what extent are the following considerations relevant to your thinking? For instance, whether or not someone suffered emotionally. So these are examples for how we could ask for people's prosociality or their morality by just literally asking themselves. So it seems pretty straightforward, right? It seems like this should be highly valid ways of measuring prosociality and morality. But are they? Are they really? Is the question I want to pose. So do you really, I guess it looks like you get what you ask, and in that sense, these things are valid. But there are some red flags that should, as psychology students, immediately come to your attention. One of them is to ask yourself, there we are. One of them is to ask yourself whether your respondents actually share your interpretation of the question. So do you formulate the question in a way that all of the people who are trying to answer the question will understand it the same way that you intended it to. So, for instance, if we go back to just the question posed from the Moral Foundations questionnaire that I just read to you, remember it goes, when you decide whether something is right or wrong, to what extent are the following considerations relevant to your thinking? What does that mean, relevant to my thinking? Does this mean that this is like the most important reason for me? Does it even come up in my mind? At which point is something relevant to my thinking? I'm not sure what the threshold would be. And perhaps even more clearly, we could make an argument that it's difficult to kind of zone in on the same interpretation when we go to the example item, whether or not someone suffered emotionally. What does it mean that someone suffered emotionally? Does it mean that someone gets upset? Does it mean that they cry? What is the level at which we would consider something emotional suffering? Now, if my respondents have different interpretations of this, they will answer the question differently. And given that I don't know these different interpretations, I might make assumptions about their morality that are just based on actually falsely or differently understanding my question. So this is one problem with asking people these kinds of global self-report questions. We're not sure if we all share a common interpretation and explanation of what the question means. And a second problem is that we have to wonder if people are actually able to assess these motivations. So can I even say this about myself? Here are some examples for why it might be problematic to assume that people can do this. First, we have to wonder whether perhaps there are differences in our respondents in their ability to retrieve examples from long-term memory. So if I think about myself and I ask myself if I'm a moral person, for instance, by trying to answer the question whether someone's emotional suffering is relevant to my thinking when I try to decide if something's right or wrong to do. I might have to think back to situations in the past where I've had to make such a decision, and then did I think about people's emotional suffering? My ability to retrieve examples from long-term memory might influence my response, right? So if I'm good at recalling situations where I've done this, but someone else is bad, we might give different answers, even though our actual behaviors look fairly similar. Also, if we've had recent experiences that are actually kind of overshadowing our long-term memory, we might again give different answers. So if only today, before I came here to record this lecture, I just did the most amazing thing because I gave a homeless person $500, which I didn't. Perhaps I should have, but let's imagine that I did that. And then I can now think back and ask myself, okay, so on that walk that I went today, and then I gave this person this money, did I consider how they were feeling emotionally? And I can say, well, yes, I was feeling sorry for them because I thought they were suffering on the street. That mattered to me so much, I'm going to give this a 10. Someone who doesn't have that recent experience might give a different answer because they don't have this recent experience overpowering their own assessment of themselves. We can also wonder what people can even know about themselves. Here I would direct you to the classical study of Nisbet and Wilson, 1977. If you have some time to read this one. It asks basically very poignantly the question whether people can accurately introspect and self-report anything. And finally, we could even wonder if people are even willing to honestly and accurately give answers to these questions. And in particular, when it's about morality and prosociality, social desirability might actually play a big role. So I know that I should have a certain perspective on this. I should always consider people's emotional suffering a lot. So I'm just going to answer that in my questionnaire, even if I don't. If our participants think like that, then we might think they are actually super moral people, even though they might actually not be. So actually asking very straightforward questions to assess people's prosociality and morality can actually get us into a bit of trouble. So how can we try to get around this? What we can do is, instead of asking people to assess if they're a good moral person or not, we can ask people to make decisions, to choose what they would do. And I'm going to discuss in a second why that's an improvement, potentially, also which drawbacks it has. But for now, let's take a look at an example as before. So if we ask people to make decisions, first of all, let's start with hypothetical decisions. What do I mean by hypothetical? It means that people aren't actually making the decision. We just present them with a scenario, or we might often call it vignette. And we present people with a vignette, and then in the end, we ask them to make a choice. So we ask them to imagine this is what was happening, and while they're sitting in their armchair or quietly in our lab or whatever, we're asking them to imagine what is happening and then to say what they would do if this was happening. So here's an example, and this is a really classical one. The trolley dilemma. It goes like this. It goes, you see a runaway trolley moving towards 5 people on the tracks. You are standing next to a lever that controls a switch. If you pull the lever, the trolley will be redirected onto a side track, and the 5 people on the main track will be saved. However, there's a single person on the side track, and now you have 2 options. Either you do nothing and you allow the trolley to run its course and kill the 5 people on the main track, or you pull the lever and you divert the trolley onto the side track where it will kill 1 person. Now, what is the more ethical option? Or rather, what would you do? This is an example of asking people about a moral situation. And I have another example. This one is for prosociality. It goes like this. So imagine you are the citizen of a sub-Saharan country suffering from famine and disease. 2 members of your family, your 75-year-old grandfather and your 3-month-old nephew, are asleep in their house, which has caught fire. You only have time and strength to rescue 1. Whom would you help? Okay, so this is clearly about helping behavior. Therefore, we would file it under the draw of prosocial behavior, but you can clearly see that this also might have some moral implications. Okay, so what do we think about these hypothetical decisions? Do we feel like maybe this is an improvement? Well, you could say, again, you get what you ask, right? It seems relatively straightforward. If I give you a situation and I ask you to say what you would do in that situation, that's presumably the answer that people would give. But again, we could think of some criticisms. So one piece of criticism is to ask whether our participants, or like us as people who are making a decision in this vignette, we could ask whether we can even imagine the scenario. So can I imagine being a person who lives in a sub-Saharan country that's suffering from famine and disease? Can I imagine that my house is on fire and I have the choice between saving my grandma and saving my nephew? Can I imagine standing at a lever that could save 5 people, but I would kill 1 by redirecting a runaway trolley? When does that even ever happen? So the situations that we posit there, these hypothetical situations, they can be more or less difficult to imagine, and actually people might be more or less good at imagining these situations. So that might get us into some trouble when we try to analyze their answers. We could also run into trouble because we might ask whether people even make the effort of imagining the scenario. So do we actually believe that someone's trying to put themselves into the scenario just because we ask them to? Like, do you actually think that they will think it through? And now you could have different opinions on that. And one of them would be that yes, if participants come to the lab and they participate in an experiment, they usually tend to invest effort because this is what's expected, and often they get paid for it. But on the other hand, you might compare hypothetical scenarios with those that are non-hypothetical, and then just look where do people put in more effort, and you would find, well, if it's hypothetical, no, people don't really care quite as much. So that might be a problem for us, whether we can actually get the people that we ask to put themselves into our situation, to take it seriously, and then to give an answer. But even if we manage to do that, we have a different problem, which is that we have to wonder whether people can actually predict their own behavior. So what I think I will do, or like what I in a specific situation, might actually differ wildly from what I do when I am in this particular situation. So when I look at situations where we compare hypotheticals with actual real life behavior, there are quite some differences, in particular in the domain of social preferences. So when it's about prosociality, there are some differences in how people say they would behave and how they will behave in the end. So for instance, if people play a dictator game, and what that is we'll get to in a second, they're nicer to others when it's hypothetical, more generous to other people, as compared to when they are just in a hypothetical situation where they're asked, do you want to be a generous person? And they say, yes, I'm all for it. There's a bunch of evidence that there are differences in pro-social behavior. So if I'm asked whether I think I would help someone, I'm more inclined to say yes. Also, maybe there's some self-serving bias involved there. I like to think of myself as a pro-social person. So in a hypothetical situation, I would be more inclined to be helpful than when it actually comes to the situation and I really have to help. So maybe you could think of a situation where someone kind of abstractly asked you if they were going to move, you were going to help them carry some boxes, and you're like, oh yes, absolutely. But then when moving day comes, are you actually going to show up? Are you actually going to go and help? Yeah. And the same is true for moral behavior. So we might see differences in how egalitarian people are, how much they value fairness. And they say in hypothetical situations, I value fairness a lot. But when it comes at their own expense, or like when they actually have to do something to make stuff fair, they might not be as enthusiastic and as involved. So these are some issues that we have with hypothetical decisions. So what can we do to get over them? Well, the easy fix would be to try to put these into real life, right? So instead of asking people, imagine what it would be like to yada, 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 insert vignette here, we could ask people, okay, here is a situation. We will exactly enact this situation depending on your choice. And that's what we would call an incentivized decision.